Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Yuuei Survival Guide. This will be Part 3, Chapter 2. After school that day, Izuku had returned home to his quiet apartment after making a quick stop at a convenience store nearby to grab himself some instant ramen for dinner. With his mother gone most of the time, there wasn't usually a lot of food in the house. But that didn't matter because Izuku didn't really need breakfast. He'd always settled for a school lunch at the cafeteria, since it was offered and convenient. And when taking that option, he usually had a few hundred yen to spare to buy something for dinner, whether it be instant ramen, a bag of chips, or even just a cheap chocolate bar he picks up with what limited pocket change he has. As long as he had one decent meal during the day, he was usually good to go. Overall, it had been a good first day of school, Izuku decided, as he stared down at the small carton of steaming water and noodles. He sat at the dining room table, fidgeting with the small packet of powdered broth and seasoning as he waits for the ramen noodles to cook. Sure, he'd literally almost been expelled. He'd broken a finger in the process of trying to not get expelled, and he was a bit afraid of his new sensei, but it had also been good too. Or it hadn't ended as awfully as it could have. He was still a UA student, even after all of that, right? That's good. That's all he can really ask for. Plus, he'd come out of this with 2 new friends, which is more friends than he'd thought he'd make, especially on the first day. Ida and Uraraka, who'd been friendly enough to meet up with him after school when Izuku was released from Recovery Girl's office, so that the 3 of them could walk to the train station together. He can't remember the last time he'd walked home with friends. And not to mention the ghost he'd met, too. Shirakumo. He was a friendly guy, despite the whole ghost thing. Izuku's not entirely sure if the guy really qualified as a new friend or not. He didn't typically befriend ghosts, so this was uncharted territory for Izuku. But Shirakumo was definitely nice, and Izuku thinks he'd like to have him as a friend. Either way, he was there too, ghost or not. Izuku was glad for the company of the ghost, so he's sure he counted as a new friend as well. So he'd made 3, 2.5 perhaps, new friends on the first day. Seriously, how lucky was he? He hadn't really expected to make any friends, let alone friends who were so nice. And he hadn't gotten expelled on the first day either, even if it hadn't looked so good for a second there. He'll definitely consider it a successful first day. Honestly, what more could he ask for after how that morning's class had gone? It was a miracle he'd survived today, that he'd managed to scrape his way past that apprehension test without getting expelled, despite how much Izuku thinks his new teacher had every intention of expelling the student in last place. He'd said it was a rational deception, but he'd looked pretty serious about it. Something about how the teacher had cornered him after erasing his quirk told him the man didn't exactly jest like he'd insisted. Izuku didn't know what changed, why the teacher took pity on him at the last minute, but he's grateful for it. He's grateful for a chance. Then, of course, there was the fact that a teacher had stopped Kachan from pummeling him with crackling palms and burning explosions. That was pretty good. Izuku didn't know what to think about that. Aizawa-sensei had honestly scared the crap out of him with his crazy cool quirk, scary words, and capture weapon. But then he'd protected him from Kachan when he could have turned a blind eye like everyone else always did. Izuku really doesn't know what to think about that. And on top of all that stuff, he'd managed to make some improvements with One for All when he was desperate. He could compartmentalize where he wanted to use it and minimize damage to his body because of it. Sure, it wasn't bounds and leaps into understanding his new quirk, but it was baby steps in the right direction. He doesn't exactly have ample time or space to practice a new quirk, and he doesn't always have a teacher at his disposal either, with All Might always so busy with his hero career. So anything he can figure out on his own, is a step in the right direction. Anything is better than nothing, right? He hopes All Might will be proud of his progress in just a day of classes. He really can't wait to tell the #1 hero what he'd achieved. When the noodles were finally soft enough to be edible, Izuku dumped in the packet of soup base and dried vegetables that he'd been fiddling with thoughtlessly, and mixed it with his chopsticks. While he waited an additional second for the vegetables to rehydrate, he tugged the class syllabus out of his backpack to read over like Aizawa-sensei had suggested when they'd parted after class. There wasn't anything particularly thrilling in it. He'd been waiting for this for years. He knew the basics of what this class would entail. Despite this being a UA class, it's really not much different than any other syllabus he'd read. It mostly has to do with their core classes and class schedule, so it's not very exciting. Izuku's still excited to see who their teachers will be. He can only imagine the number of pro heroes he'll get to meet, just attending such an amazing school. He finished off his dinner as he read before retreating to his bedroom. It was the only room in the apartment that had any personality, and the only real personality it did have was, well, All Might. Izuku liked to surround himself with inspiration, and what better inspiration was there than the #1 pro hero? And, okay, fine. Maybe he was a bit of a fanboy. Izuku doesn't know how people could not be fans of All Might. He was one of the greatest heroes in history. He was strong, smart, cool, and obviously heroic. If that wasn't inspiring, he didn't know what was. The teen makes his way over to his desk, pulling out one of his notebooks from his school bag as he drops it to the floor by his bed. He drops ungracefully into his desk chair, flipping the notebook open as he selected a pencil from a cup on his desk. The book was already full, but there was still some space to add more information on specific pros he'd analyzed. Like, for example, Eraserhead. He didn't have much on the underground hero. There wasn't even much about him online. Izuku had scoured the internet when he'd stumbled upon Eraserhead's hero name on a hero forum he frequented. Izuku thinks the man must be doing something right if he's so elusive, even online. Seriously, there are barely any videos of the guy out there. Izuku would know. He'd spent hours searching for anything on Eraserhead. And of what Izuku had managed to dig up, you couldn't even get a good look at the quick-footed hero, and the footage was always grainy at best. But now Izuku had met Eraserhead. He'd met the man firsthand, and he'd seen his quirk in action. Izuku had assumed Eraserhead's quirk might have something to do with erasing, given the hero name, but he'd never imagined a quirk powerful enough to strip away someone else's quirk. Something strong enough to erase one for All Might's quirk. That's crazy strong. Though Izuku supposes at the end of the day, One for All is an emitter type, which is vulnerable to Sensei's quirk. Izuku hums to himself, tapping the eraser end of his pencil against his lips as he thinks. What are Eraserhead's limitations? Can he erase mutation-type quirks or just emitters like One for All and Explosion? How long would he be able to cancel a quirk? He'd mentioned Dry Eye, but how much does that really affect him? Izuku wonders if his teacher would even answer such questions if he'd asked, but decides that he will not be asking any invasive questions. It's probably not wise to ask someone who works in the shadows like Eraserhead questions like that anyway. Plus, he'd only just met his new teacher. It's probably too soon to be bothering him about his quirk. And not just his quirk, but his amazing support gear too. The capture weapon. Izuku had never seen anything like it, so the gear is probably unique to Eraserhead. That was super awesome. It's no wonder he was such a great hero, even without a flashy or physically strong quirk. Izuku hunches down over the notebook, scribbling down everything new he'd learned about the pro. It's always satisfying watching the blank lines slowly fill with information, and Eraserhead's analysis had been relatively empty for way too long. No matter how hard he'd tried to dig up information, he'd always come up short, but he's always been interested in a pro who could reportedly temporarily erase quirks. Who wouldn't find that cool? When he was finished recording his data, Izuku slid the older journal back into his backpack with the others before digging out his newest notebook. This one only had a couple pages filled in, so he plans to use it to analyze his new classmates and new teachers' quirks if he hasn't already. He's super excited to see what everyone's truly capable of. He can tell they're all strong and powerful just from watching them problem solve with their quirks during the apprehension test that morning. He has no doubt that most of his new classmates will make great pros when they graduate. He only hopes he's right there with them in the end. Izuku shakes his head fondly at the thought, flipping to the next available page in the notebook. Shirakumo Oboro. Quirk? Question mark. Hero name? Question mark. Usually, he'd add more information he observed, like strengths and weaknesses, details of their quirk. Sometimes chosen quirk names are misleading. Superpower, the cover name he'd chosen for his own quirk, is definitely a little misleading, Izuku thinks, but it's better than any other alternative. Attack strategies, support gear, and maybe a drawing of the person's hero costume if he's got the time. But he didn't know much about Shirakumo. He only really knew the ghost's name. But still, if he looks at this logically, it's safe to assume Shirakumo does, in fact, have a quirk if he's wearing the school uniform. Though hero schools do accept quirkless applicants now, that's a pretty new development. Izuku doesn't know how old Shirakumo is or when he'd passed away, but he doesn't remember seeing any death of a Yuuei student in the last couple years since the new bill was passed. Izuku isn't even sure there has been a quirkless student, despite the fact quirkless kids can apply. So, he'd have to have some kind of super cool, amazing quirk, right? Izuku taps the tip of his pencil against the page, frowning down at the blank lines. Then, he shuts the book with a sigh and leans back against the backrest of his desk chair with a groan. He's getting ahead of himself. Shirakumo is a ghost. The boy sighs again as he slips the book into his backpack with the others. He doesn't even know if he'll ever see the ghost again, so recording an analysis of him is dumb. Still, Izuku can't help but hope he does see the ghost again, despite how he'd always made an effort to keep away from the afterlife. There's just something about Shirakumo that makes Izuku want to be his friend. Maybe it's how the ghost had reacted when he'd realized Izuku could see him, or just how kind he was during class. Izuku's not sure he would have made it out of that class with his dignity intact if it weren't for the ghost's encouragement. Maybe the ghost will become a permanent in his school life? Perhaps he'll see the ghost tomorrow. He did hang around Aizawa-sensei, right? He'd definitely be seeing his homeroom teacher tomorrow, so there's a good chance he'll see the ghost as well. He hopes, at least. Izuku does see Shirakumo the next morning, except instead of in Aizawa-sensei's class, the blue-haired boy is perched on the front desk in Yamada-sensei's class. English was his first class of the day, and would be followed by all the other core classes. After lunch was when the fun really started, when they had heroics training, so the morning was more or less just regular school. Izuku was one of the first kids in the classroom, so when he enters the room, the ghost's head quirks in his direction before he beams in excitement. "I thought I might find you here," Shirakumo chirped, slipping off the teacher's desk before falling into step with Izuku as the teen makes his way to his own desk, plopping down in his chair. "I took a peek at your schedule and saw you have English with Hisashi first thing. I'm usually hanging around with him in the mornings anyways, since Sho's usually asleep until he starts teaching. That dude won't actually wake up until he has to, you know?" Izuku ducked his head in a subtle nod, shuffling the books he'll need for this class out of his backpack. He still hadn't really met Present Mike Sensei, since the whole first day had been dedicated to Aizawa Sensei's quirk apprehension test. But he'd still seen the blonde-haired teacher around the school and knew he taught here. Izuku had passed him in the hallway on his way out the school yesterday, and he was ecstatic to have the Present Mike as his teacher. Izuku has a good couple pages of analysis on the voice-quirked hero, but he hadn't actually met him yet. Izuku watched out of the corner of his eye as he organized himself as the ghost had slid up onto his desk carelessly. The ghost took up a bit of space. Well, not technically, since he was a ghost and Izuku could phase right through him if need be. But Izuku still had every intention of respecting the entity. He didn't mind the ghost sitting there if Izuku could still use his desktop for schoolwork too. As much as it didn't bother Izuku, it was still a little surprising just how comfortable the ghost was with him already. They'd only just met yesterday. Izuku simply huffs a snort of laughter to himself as he lets a smile slip onto his face. He rolls one of his pencils towards the ghost, watching silently as it rolls right through him, prompting a yelp of surprise from the apparition. Izuku had simply meant it as a warning, not a serious one, but simply a warning that the desk might not be an ideal place to sit if he doesn't want to be accidentally phased through. Izuku subtly glances around the room, making sure no one's watching before he quirks his head faintly in the pouting ghost's direction, so if anyone else is looking, they can't see him whispering to himself. Not that I mind you sitting on my desk, I just might accidentally go through you if we're sharing the same space. Just as a warning, I'll try to be careful. Ah, no biggie, Shirakumo replied easily, sporting his wide grin as he leans back on his hands. Just don't touch my butt, cool? Or you know what? Do. It's been ages since I've had any action. I'll go to second base with you, Midoriya-kun, so touch my butt if you want. I don't want, Izuku sputters, just barely managing to keep his voice down through the mortification. He must not be quiet enough because Present Mike, who'd entered the room at some point while Izuku had been distracted, glances over at him with an arched eyebrow. Izuku feels a dark flush of embarrassment crawling up his cheeks as he bows his head dismissively in the teacher's direction and hopes the man simply ignores him being weird. Izuku has half a mind to bang his head on the desktop, Shirakumo's cackle of laughter at his expense not helping in the slightest. He honestly wasn't sure if he was more embarrassed of what the ghost boy had said, or the fact that his reaction had caught the teacher's attention. "Okay over there, little listener?" Mike asked from the front of the class, clearly not receiving the silent plea Izuku had been sending his way, or maybe the man was just too kind to ignore a student acting like an idiot in his classroom. Izuku had listened to Present Mike's radio show, Put Your Hands Up Radio, for as long as he can remember, so he can tell the man is genuinely kind. I'm fine," Izuku chirps promptly, back straightening to regard the teacher with what he hopes is a disarming smile. Any confidence Izuku had had is gone when the probe blinks slowly at his antics and Izuku thinks, too much. Izuku gives a nervous laugh as he rubs the back of his neck anxiously. Thankfully, the man seems to take pity on Izuku, offering a smile of his own as he turns back to the chalkboard he'd been writing on, and continues writing out English sentences. Izuku squints at the board, just barely able to read the "Welcome to English, Class 1A," the man jots out in white chalk. As excited Izuku is to have Present Mike as an English teacher, he's also slightly dreading it. English is his worst subject. Izuku chances a quick look around the room, finding that some of his new classmates, a few who were in the room early like he is, had glanced in his direction at the disturbance. Despite how his cheeks flush once again, he knows if anyone else had caught their teacher's attention before class even starts, he'd be looking over there too. It's natural to be curious about someone making a fool of themselves. He knows that. Izuku still drops his face into his hands and silently wills their gazes away from him. When he lifts his head, glancing subtly to the side, he finds that his classmates have given up on watching him, all busy either chatting in small groups or preparing themselves for their classes. Izuku huffs out a sigh of relief, finally quirking his head back to the ghost, a light scowl on his face when he meets the ghost's charming smile. "Why do I get the distinct feeling you're going to get me into trouble one of these days?" Izuku blows out under his breath. The ghost at his side only seems to snicker in amusement, his grin widening a little, as if that were even possible. You know, you are so not the first person to theorize that, and if the past is anything to go off, you're completely correct. Oh, goody. Izuku sighs dramatically, making sure to shoot the ghost a playful smile, so he knows Izuku doesn't actually mean it. The ghost doesn't really get a chance to respond as the bell rings to signal class is starting soon, and the rest of Izuku's new classmates flood into the room and hurry to take their seats. Izuku turns away from the ghost, facing forward as every seat is quickly filled. No one wants a repeat of yesterday morning with Aizawa-sensei, so everyone is ready to start the exact moment the bell rings. Good morning, Class 1A. President Mike turns to them with a grin, voice loud with all the enthusiasm of a radio host. Welcome to your very first class of the day. The best class of the day, if I do say so. English, yo. If you don't know me, my name is Yamada Hisashi, or President Mike, if you'd like. Glad to see you're all still standing, which means Eraser wasn't too hard on you yesterday. Enough about him, though. We're gonna have a lot of fun in here, you dig? President Mike had been kind enough to do a sort of informal orientation for them, since they'd missed it yesterday at Aizawa-sensei's insistence, but he didn't stay on the topic long, clearly eager to get into his own class. He seemed to want to jump right into lessons when they had a basic understanding of the school and his specific class, clearly very enthusiastic about English. It was kind of him to take some of his class time to catch them up when he probably didn't have to. Beside him, Shirakumo had snorted out some amused comment about President Mike always having to clean up after Aizawa-sensei, and honestly, the green-haired teenager could see that. It's actually pretty amusing to think about Mike-sensei doing damage control after Aizawa-sensei's class. Izuku can't help but smile at the thought. Izuku can't help but wonder if the two teachers are friends. President Mike obviously knows Aizawa-sensei pretty well if he knows to do some damage control and debrief the students on the ceremony they missed because of the apprehension test. They could, of course, have just had classes one after the other for years, getting to know each other in that sense, as to not screw the students over completely, leaving them to flounder. But Izuku doesn't think it's just that. And if they are friends, how exactly does Shirakumo play into that? How does he know so much about their teachers? Were they his teachers at one point too? English class passes by quickly enough. Izuku's glad it's not one of those classes that just drags on and on. President Mike is a pretty good teacher, if not a bit loud sometimes, like he forgets it's first thing in the morning. He's enthusiastic about what he teaches, and in turn, they're all excited to learn. Well, as excited as they can be, stuck in an English class learning English grammar and other confusing stuff. It's boring too, don't get him wrong, but that's expected of a core class that isn't heroics training. President Mike at least teaches in a fun way, so it's not like any other English class Izuku had been stuck in. Maybe he'll even pick the language up faster if it's not mind-numbingly boring. They get assigned an English book that they'll be reading as a class, which seems interesting enough judging by the synopsis Mike-sensei translates for them. It might even be something he'd read in his spare time, if it weren't for the language he barely speaks, but he just adds it to his collection of notebooks he already totes around in his backpack. What's one more, right? During the lesson, Izuku half-heartedly keeps an eye on the ghost out of the corner of his eye. Shirakumo seemed relatively comfortable in President Mike's class, just like he had in Aizawa-sensei's. The ghost has no qualms about slipping off of Izuku's desk and settling on top of the teacher's desk at the front of the room, or standing right beside President Mike as the teacher writes on the chalkboard. Izuku tries really hard not to let the ghost distract him, but he knows he's slipping up. Come on, how is he not supposed to let his eyes follow a ghost pacing back and forth in front of the teacher, at the front of the room? That's distracting. Izuku tries to at least be subtle about it, forcing his attention back onto President Mike when he realizes he'd let his attention waver. But he still feels his teacher's gaze on him every so often. Izuku even makes the mistake of looking up at President Mike, only to find the teacher literally looking at him with a furrowed brow, despite how the man doesn't stop teaching. Izuku averts his gaze quickly, eyes trained down on the notebook in front of him. And when he looks back up, the man is looking back at the book in his hands, still teaching. At least he hadn't drawn any attention to Izuku. He thinks he might actually die if a teacher were to call him out again on just the second day of classes. It's bad enough Aizawa-sensei had singled him out yesterday over his quirk. Talk about making him an outcast. As the lesson carries on, Shirakumo seems to forget about Izuku for the most part, clearly comfortable going about his business as if this is second nature to him. Izuku wonders how long he's just been hanging around these two men for, if he can act like this with them. The ghost hovers close, doesn't seem bothered in the least as he sidesteps gracefully around present Mike, as if he knows exactly where the teacher will go as he speaks. At one point, Shirakumo even leans in far too close to present Mike when he attempts to read over his shoulder, to which the man lets out a hiss through his teeth and jumps to the side at what Izuku knows to be an intense chill settling in his body. The man's shoulders tremble with a shiver before he laughs awkwardly and flashes the startled class a grin. I should give you listeners a heads up now. The man rubs the back of his neck sheepishly. The AC unit in the school acts up sometimes, so if you get chills easily, it's best to keep a sweater handy, yo. This room in particular can be super chilly, if you catch my drift. Izuku lets his eyes lull in Shirakumo's direction, the pouting ghost cutting off his own apology that went unheard to the bro who'd swiftly returned to his lesson. The pout on the ghost's face swiftly curls into a light glare directed at the teacher. AC, huh? I'll show you chilly. This can't be good. Izuku bows his head, biting back a sigh. Then, without another word, the ghost steps right through present Mike, prompting a yelp of surprise from the teacher. A look of unease clouds Shirakumo's face, but Izuku has absolutely no sympathy for a ghost who gave himself the sick feeling by being petty. Mike-sensei even loses control of his quirk for a second, a bit of his voice quirk leaking into the surprise sound he makes. Izuku's ears ring as he shoots the ghost an unimpressed look, which has Shirakumo offering a sheepish, guilty grin. Mike-sensei apologizes for the accident promptly, glancing at the spot he'd sprung away from as he laughs at himself. After a quick check-in with the students to make sure no one's ears were hurting too much, the ringing in Izuku's ears dying down along with the rest of the class, the man continues on with his lesson, mostly unfazed. Something about the reaction tells Izuku that this is probably not a first for the voice hero. Don't give me that look. That was not my fault. Shirakumo clearly feels the need to defend himself when Izuku glances over at him once again. I mean, you heard what he called me, an AC. Do I look like an AC? No. He hurt my feelings, and that was totally his fault. He's the one who tried to deafen you guys. I'm innocent. He's the bully. Izuku can't help the laugh he lets out, just barely managing to hide it behind his fist and a well-timed cough. Still, Izuku feels his teacher's gaze flick in his direction at the disruption. But he's too busy trying to hide his smile in his fist and forcing his attention onto the book in front of him to dare looking up and meeting the teacher's gaze. In addition to present Mike watching him, he feels Shirakumo's eyes on him too, though his look seems fond. Izuku pretends to not notice the stupidly proud look on Shirakumo's face when his eyes briefly lift to the ghost's face. Izuku has a bad feeling he just enabled Shirakumo in some way. Yeah, it's going to be a long year. The rest of class thankfully passes by with little other distractions. Shirakumo, who looked scolded by Izuku's glare when he'd obstructed Izuku's view of the chalkboard when he was trying to copy down notes before present Mike moved on, ended up back on Izuku's desk, perched on the edge of it, out of Izuku's direct line of sight. The ghost slouched pathetically with a pout, but Izuku paid him no mind. You know, the ghost drawled cheekily toward the end of class, Izuku scribbling down an answer to a question on a worksheet present Mike had handed out. You could just use me as a cheat sheet, right? I mean, I've been in this class for, I don't know, ever? I'm sure I could read that book cover to cover in perfect English at this point, by the number of times I've read along over Zashi's shoulder in class. That worksheet is nothing to me, so, want help? You are aware that would be cheating, right? Izuku scoffs under his breath, not even looking at the ghost. The worksheet in question was simply to gauge where they stood with English, so Mike Sensei knew what he needed to focus on teaching to get everyone in the same boat, or so he'd said. He'd spent most of class going over the basics, adjectives, nouns, verbs, basic punctuation. English was hard. Izuku already knows he's going to struggle with punctuation. He hardly knows where to put commas on the worksheet. Ah, Shirakumo waggles a finger matter-of-factly. It's only really cheating if you get caught, and I seriously doubt anyone will be able to catch you getting answers from a ghost they can't see, hear, or even so much as sense unless I happen to get close to them. You could get away with it easily. Say the word and I'll help. I'm starting to doubt that you were actually a student at this school, Izuku remarks under his breath, angling his head to look at the ghost. Thankfully, his seat is beside the window, so it doesn't look overly weird for him to be staring to the side. It would look weirder if he was staring at the wall or another student. Right now, it just looks like he's distracted by the outside world. I gotta say, your morals are questionable for a heroic student. I definitely was. Shirakumo snaps back with a laugh. He doesn't appear angry or sad, his tone taking a teasing edge that makes Izuku smile. It's way too easy to banter with the ghost. This'll definitely get him into trouble at some point. I mean, the uniform doesn't lie, my friend. We match, and my morals are perfectly fine, thank you very much. I still just don't understand the usefulness of knowing the English language. Well, unless you planned on touring America like All Might or something. But if you're going to be Japan-based, what's the point? Sounds like English is your favorite subject. Izuku's not sure where his quiet, sarcastic drawl comes from. The corner of his lip curls into a tiny smile when the ghost responds, though. There's just so many rules, the ghost cried out. Dumb rules. How can words be said the exact same way but spelled differently? There, Midoriya. What's up with that? And don't even get me started on read and read. It's literally the same word, but you pronounce it differently depending on when you're saying it. And all the weird sounds you have to make or you're saying it wrong. Ugh. English has no right to be so hard. Izuku blows out a breathy chuckle, gaze flicking to the front of the room where Mike Sensei was now writing something on the chalkboard, before looking back at the ghost when he knows the coast is clear to do so. He doesn't respond to the ghost because as he opens his mouth to do so, he just ends up snapping his jaw shut when present Mike spins around to address them. Shirakumo lets out a snort of bright laughter as Izuku's teeth click together as he shuts his mouth. He shoots the ghost a glance of annoyance, but he knows he probably looks amused. Classes with Shirakumo at his side might actually be a bit harder than Izuku first thought. Thankfully, his new ghost friend doesn't follow him to every class. After they're dismissed from English class, he doesn't really see the ghost again after the spirit follows him just a couple steps out the classroom. He sees Shirakumo wave out of the corner of his eyes as they part ways. Izuku's fingers twitching at his side in an attempt to return the gesture without looking like a complete idiot waving at nothing. Izuku's a little bummed he didn't get to verbally say goodbye to his friend, since Ida and Uraraka had managed to drag him into a conversation as they walked as a group to their next class, which happened to be math class. He almost misses the icy chill of the entity beside him, but he's also content to have a chance to focus on his living friends as well. Ida isn't as scary as Izuku at first thought. Despite his stern and serious nature, he's actually a really nice guy. He's just very serious about his school career, which Izuku understands. He wants to do well, too. Uraraka is just as bubbly as she'd been yesterday, asking him if his finger was better after his visit to Recovery Girl, and telling them about her morning where she'd accidentally used her quirk on her shoe when she picked it up and almost lost it, because she'd been half asleep getting ready that morning. She laughs at herself, even as her cheeks flush faintly in embarrassment, so Izuku laughs along with her. The girl is friendly in a way people haven't been to him since before his friends started getting quirks, and it's refreshing. He likes the two of them. Not to mention he needs a good influence on him after hanging out with Shirakumo, who wasn't, well, the greatest influence, at least from what Izuku's seen thus far. He supposed ghosts didn't really have consequences to their actions, nor did people really notice them. Not like Izuku, who could face detention or even expulsion if he were caught cheating in any way. Plus, he really needs some living friends too, and if these two are offering to be his friends, he's more than happy to accept. It's been a long time since he's actually had friends. As he listens to Ida and Uraraka argue half-heartedly about something, Izuku can't help but think about Shirakumo. He wondered if the ghost was like how he is now, when he actually attended UA as a living student. He can't imagine any student getting by cheating, like he'd so easily suggested Izuku do, so perhaps the carefree nature had come after he'd passed on. Like he'd thought earlier, it's not like a ghost would have any repercussions, right? He adds the thought to his ever-growing list of questions he's dying to ask the ghost. Morning classes finish off faster than Izuku thought they were going to, surprising, which is great because it means they'll be on to heroics training soon. He can't wait. He's been giddy about their first official heroics lesson since yesterday. You can't be a UA student, a 1A student specifically, and not be ecstatic to have heroics classes at such an exemplary school. He can't wait to see what it's like, having dreamed about this for so long. Izuku finds himself caught in the mass of students heading for the lunchroom with Ida, Uraraka, and a couple other classmates. The lunchroom is huge, tables scarcely placed to accommodate everyone, but it's still chaotic and busy with students coming and going. There are students milling around, others in line to get cafeteria lunch. There's a lot of chatter, a lot of the tables filled with students already enjoying their lunch. The lunch line is long, but it moves surprisingly fast. The food is a bit more expensive than Izuku's used to a school lunch being, but no other school lunch he's ever had been made by Pro Hero Lunch Rush. So it's totally worth the extra couple $100, because it's delicious. And really, it's cheap by all standards considering just what they're getting for the price. Not that he expected anything less from a school as renowned as UA, but to Izuku, whose income hadn't changed since his mother started spending less time at home, leaving him nothing more than a few bills of currency on the table to get himself by with. It's a bit on the pricey side. Still, it's cheap for the quality and amount you get, and it's the only option he's got if he wants enough sustenance to get through the school day. He's used to school food that tastes like cardboard but fills him up. The cheapest stuff the school can get its hands on so they can sell it for dirt cheap, too. What Lunch Rush makes leaves him full and satisfied. It even tastes homemade, which isn't something Izuku is very familiar with these days. It's totally worth spending the majority of his evening money on. When he gets his food, he ends up eating with Uraraka, Ida, and some of their other classmates who sit at their table with them, and at tables nearby. It's funny that even when they don't have to, the class still tends to gravitate towards each other in the mess hall. The school is huge, and there are a lot of other students. They might not be very familiar with each other yet, but they are still the most familiar in this setting. Izuku finds himself looking back over his shoulder every so often in an attempt to spot Shirakumo, but he doesn't. He tries not to frown, wondering where the ghost is and what he's gotten up to without Izuku around, but instead of worrying too hard about the ghost, he manages to force his attention on his other new friends. He actually doesn't see the ghost for the rest of the school day, which is odd, when the ghost had hovered during his first class. Actually, they don't see Aizawa-sensei either. But that's okay, because All Might is the one leading them through their first heroics class. Izuku can't wait to see what battle trials are all about. All right, listeners, this concludes the first half to Chapter 2 of Yuuei Survival Guide. I'm really enjoying this re-recording. This has been fun so far. I hope you all are enjoying it as well. The second half to this chapter will be up next. I would love to hear the reactions you're having to everything so far. I just love the way the author writes Shirakumo's personality throughout this fic. There's so much humor that takes place, but also just that nice balance, right, of like angst in there too. There's that worry, right, as readers that we're experiencing for Izuku, the relationship he has with his mother, who's not really present, right? The fact that Izuku is trying to stretch out money, the higher cost of food at UA. So all these things that are taking place. And at the same time, he's got this new establishment of friends, right? He's got a couple in-person friends like Ida and Uraraka, but also Shirakumo in the role he plays. So I'd love to hear what you're thinking. Drop your comments down below for me. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.